Last week I introduced an idea that the idea that we are a blessing to Thames, and that we are relevant to Thames. And our relevance relies on the fact of our Christian spirituality. That is our gift to the world. In a world which is struggling with the messiness of life and the confusion of life, we can offer hope through Christian spirituality. And last week I identified Christian spirituality as different to just ordinary spirituality, but it's really Christ-focused. But I also said last week that if we're going to offer that to the world, to Thames, then we need to demonstrate it in our congregation. We can't do until we can be. I said that the key to Christian spirituality is a word called love. Love. Jesus stated it with these words in John 13, 34 and 35. He says, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Do you think he's labouring the point there? You know, that 3 times he says, love one another. In the original Greek and the original Hebrew, they didn't have underlining, and they didn't have bold text. But I'm sure if they had, that would have been underlined and bold text. Love one another. And the theme of loving one another is continued by John in his own letters later on in 1 John 3:10. He said, "This is how we know who the children of God are and who the children of the devil are. Anyone who does not do what is right is not God's child, nor is anyone who does not love their brother or sister. For this is the message you heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love one another. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him. This is how we know what love is. Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother and sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." And further on in that same letter, he says, "And this is his command, to believe in the name of the Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as he commanded us." Today I want to look at what love could look like, or should look like, or even does look like in this congregation. We all know the one another verses, and I remember many years ago Brian preaching a whole series on all the one another verses at Invercargill Central. And he took one each time, and it went forever, because there are so many one another verses. But I'm going to talk about the overarching words in that one another series. Next week I'm going to talk about loving your neighbours. That's a different kettle of fish. The church is supposed to be, according to Brian Hathaway, who was a leading light in churches in the old days, in the 1980s I think it was, at Te Atatu Bible Chapel. Yeah. And he said the church is supposed to be a credible witness to the love, justice and mercy of God to the surrounding communities. God has chosen the church to model something of his kingdom purposes to a watching world. The world is watching us. And they say, is this thing real? Is this thing called Christianity real? Let me look and see what people are doing in the congregations where they claim that Christianity exists. As people look to us and how we treat others within the family of God, what do they see? What is it that we're modelling? One of the hurdles we have to overcome, we get is every time you start talking about God to people, is they say, why then are there so many different churches? Why are there so many denominations? Well, they don't say denominations, they say so many different religions. And we've tried to address that as pastors in this town. Brian was instrumental in that, and getting the pastors together and trying to talk about unity rather than doing our own things in our own silos. And we have, before COVID, we were having 2 or 3 combined services a year, where all the churches would come together and we would be able to share and recognise the love that exists. Because what we say is that the denominations are not differences. They're not separate. They're not disunity. What they are is that they are catering to a particular niche in the community that God has created that church for. And so when we see all of those denominations as being relevant, they're all part of the church, but they're different expressions of the church. And when we see that, and when we recognise that we alone here at Thames Baptist or any other denomination, we're not the font of all knowledge. We're not the holder of God's total truth. The rest of the denominations also hold the truth, and they have a different expression of it, and God bless them, because they are all part of our family. But coming from the bigger town-wide, coming back down to this congregation, we can't show love to the people in the community if we're not showing love to each other within the congregation. Now, this is not a subtle hint saying there is disunity in the congregation. That's not what I'm saying. This is not one of those, I'm telling you about this because there are problems. But I'm saying this is the foundational stuff of what a community of God looks like. Are we doing some of it? Are we doing it well? I'll leave that to you. But this is not a undercover way of saying, hey, we've got disunity, because I don't think we have. But we are to love one another as Christ loves us. We know about the injunctions in the Bible about husbands loving their wives and wives loving their husbands, and employers looking after their employees, and employers looking after the employees, and employees looking to their bosses, and all that sort of stuff. But the overarching thought in all of this is love one another. And even the 10 Commandments, the second half of the 10 Commandments is about loving one another. They may be specific, like do not steal, do not murder, do not lie, do not give false witness. But if you loved one another, you wouldn't do any of those things anyway. The church is to reflect the love, justice, and righteousness of God's kingdom within society. Stephen Charles Mott commented that the community in which, through its behaviour and mission, the reign of God becomes visible, serving as a precursor and avant-garde of a society that will be filled in all hope. Through its behaviour and mission, the reign of God becomes visible. Through our behaviour in our congregation, the reign of God becomes visible. In the epistles, we are constantly urged to love one another. Just 2 examples. In Romans 12:10, it says, love one another with brotherly affection. I don't know, what's the gender-neutral version of that? With genuine affection. And in Galatians 5:13, through love, serve one another. What's obvious as we read the scriptures is Jesus' own relationships and the early Christian missionary togetherness, the connectedness of the early church. All of the glue of that was the loving, Christ-exalting personal relationships. That should be normal, essential Christianity. All the one another verses of Paul are outworkings of the command from Jesus, love one another. Peter in 2 Peter 1:7 says, have brotherly love, or sisterly love, and Christian love And in 1 Peter 1:22 and 1 Peter 4:8 it says, fervently love one another. No wishy-washy, put on your false smile, pretend you love them, but fervently love each other. The word love is described not in feelings, but in terms of action. Because, as we know, feelings lie. Joy Cowley, New Zealand poet and prayer writer, describes love by comparing it with its opposite, which is fear. And she says, the voice of love always comes from a heart space. The voice of fear comes from the mind. Love is quiet and gentle. Fear is loud and strident. Love opens us up. Fear closes us down. Love sees beauty. Fear sees ugliness. Love is unitive. Fear is divisive. Love takes us forward to a larger place, but fear draws us back to a narrow place. We all know the passage about the fruit of the Spirit. But it's argued that that passage really is only talking about one fruit. And that one fruit is love. And all of the attributes that are mentioned after love, peace, joy, long-suffering, etc., they're all outworkings of that first description, which is love. And if you remember back to what Diane read to us this morning from 1 Corinthians 13, you will see there is actually a correlation between that passage and the Galatians fruit of the Spirit passage. You'll find that they correspond. What they're saying about in 1 Corinthians 13 and what they're saying in Galatians is exactly the same. The fruit of the Spirit grows out of love. Love is the primary grace of the Christian life. It is a foundation from which all other graces grow. Paul instilled it as the greatest virtue in Christian life in Galatians 5:13. And Jesus declared the supremacy of love. And the fruit that we produce from that love is the litmus test of whether we are authentic or not. Love is the litmus test of whether we are authentic or not. Love is the key to Christian community. The key to Christian community is not our programs or our dogma or our statements. It's not about our banner or our slogan. It's about love. I remember a song way back called His Banner Over Me is Love. It's in olden days. The banner is still true. See, believing without loving is what gives religion a bad name. Believing without loving destroys lives. Believing without loving turns the best of creeds into weapons of oppression. A community that believes but does not love or marginalise love soon becomes a synagogue of Satan, which it says in Revelations 2:9. Love is not only an individual attribute, but it should be an attribute of the community of faith that is the congregation. We look around and we see a whole bunch of marbles sitting here in the pews. But when we come together in gathered worship, Brian Smith, the former principal of Carey College, used to say that we come in as marbles, but during the process of a worship service, we become one. We may come in as individual marbles, but we won't leave as individual marbles because we are one. The oneness of God is not the oneness of distinct, self-contained individuals. It's the unity of a community of persons who love each other and live together in harmony. But it's not easy, is it? Put two people together, It ain't going to work. We're not the same, and we can rub up against each other. There's a story told of two guys on a desert island, and the people come and save them. And whilst they're talking to these two guys, they see there are 3 churches. Oh, that's his church. That's my church. That's the church I used to go to. We rub up against each other. But the result of our transforming, sanctifying ministry of the Holy Spirit is that we are enabled to love one another with the same kind of love that God loves us. God enables us to love the unlovely. Lee Iacocca, who you may know if you are in the car world, he turned Chrysler around from a bankrupt entity to a flourishing business. He once asked legendary football coach, American football coach, Vince Lombardi, what it takes to make a winning team, and Lombardi replied, "There are a lot of coaches with good ball clubs who know the fundamentals and have plenty of discipline, but still don't win a game." Then you come to the third ingredient. If you're going to play together as a team, you've got to care for each other. You've got to love each other. Each player has to be thinking about the next guy and saying to himself, if I don't block that man, then Paul is going to get his legs broken. I have to do my job well in order that he can do his well. And Lombardi says the difference between mediocrity and greatness is the feeling these guys have for each other. The difference between a church being mediocre and a church being great is the feeling of love for one another in this place, in this community. In a healthy church, each Christian learns to care for others. If we take seriously the command from Jesus to love one another, we will contribute to a winning team. But whilst we're saying, I can't live with that person, I'm going to sit on the left-hand side and well away from the person on the right-hand side, I'm going to sit at the front instead of at the back, I'm just going to ignore that that person actually exists. That is going to be divisive and pull the place apart. Real community is not uniformity, though. We're not all the same, and we don't do the same things, and we don't have the same roles, and we don't have the same attributes, but together we create the community. Richard John Neuhaus identifies the hard task of love is the discipline and devotion of disparate people bearing with each other. That's the hard part. It's not about hanging out with who we like. It's loving those whom we are with. Proverbs 27:17 is, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. But if you've ever tried sharpening anything, you'll know that you can get sparks from that. What are you going to do with those sparks? It's easy for us to get caught up in letting our emotions dictate our behaviour. We don't feel like loving, so we don't. We feel like others are unfriendly, so we don't love them. We get easily offended by other people and choose not to love those who have offended us. We often decide not to love people who rub us the wrong way. We're self-serving in our love at sometimes and choose to love only those who will give us something in return. We put conditions on our love. We find reasons why we can't love so-and-so. We claim we just can't help the way we feel. But that's rubbish. Jesus commands us to love one another. He doesn't say, except those who are nasty. He doesn't say, except for those who don't look like me. There's no conditions, no exceptions to Jesus' command, love one another. And really interestingly, that was put to the test this week. You know that we had some windows broken end of last week. We know who the guy who did it is, and he's apologised. And he's part of our wider family. We had to decide what was our response to that. So at the last council meeting, we had a vigorous discussion about that. But the end result was I rang the police and said, have you arrested him yet? And they said, no. They said, don't bother. We'll deal with him. And I went to that person's mum, because he's out of town at the moment, and said, he's welcome back. He's welcome to be here. He's still part of our family. How are we going to pay for the broken windows? I don't know. We've probably got insurance covering it. If we haven't, we'll just bite it. But it was showing the love that this topic was about. Isn't that so often I don't know about you, Brian, but when I'm writing a sermon, often I get things that relate directly to it coming up in my life. I think, oh, I better do something about that. So, but that was an action of love. In 1 Thessalonians 3:12 it says, may the Lord make your love increase and overflow for each other and for everyone else, just as ours does for you. There's a lovely book called The Velveteen Rabbit. Anyone read The Velveteen Rabbit? And the rabbit and the skin horse are discussing what it is to be real. And the skin horse explained this. Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints, and very shabby. But those things don't matter at all, because once you're real, you can't be ugly, except to the people who don't understand. I'm reminded of Paul in his writing to the church at Colossae. In Colossians 1:4, he says, we have heard of your faith in Jesus Christ and of the love you have for all God's people. The faith and love that spring from the hope stored up for you in heaven, and about which you've already heard in the true message of the gospel that has come to you. The church at Colossae was a church we should be. Where people say, I have heard of the love you have for each other. Isn't it great? It's only through our love that exists in this place do we get a hearing to those outside who look at us and say, who are you Christians? They won't listen to us unless we demonstrate love within the people that we already know. The famous preacher D.L. Moody once said, show me a church where there's love and I'll show you a church that has power in the community. In Chicago a few years ago, he says, a little boy attended a Sunday school I know of. When his parents moved to another part of the city, the little fellow still attended the same Sunday school, even though it meant a long, tiresome walk each way. And a friend asked him why he went so far, and he told him, and his friend told him there are plenty of other churches just as good but close to home. And the little boy says, they may be as good as others, good for others, but not for me. And his friend said, why not? He said, because they love a fellow over there. This boy was prepared to go the extra mile to a place where he felt loved. And D.L. Moody commented on that and said, if only we could make the world believe that we love them, there will be fewer empty churches and a smaller proportion of our population who never darken the church door. Let's replace duty with love in our church relations, and the world would soon be evangelized. But that's the focus for next week when I'm talking about loving the world. The takeaway from today is that we need to love each other in this congregation. I'm going to pray a prayer which is inspired by 1 Corinthians 13 that Diane read earlier. Let's pray. Because love is patient, help me to be slow to judge and quick to listen, hesitant to criticize but eager to encourage, remembering your endless patience with me. Because love is kind, help my words to be gentle and my actions to be thoughtful. Remind me to smile and say please and thank you, because those little things mean so much. Because love does not envy or boast and is not proud, help me to have a heart that is humble and see the good in others. May I celebrate and appreciate all that I have and all that I am, as well as doing the same for those around me. Because love is not rude or self-seeking, help me to speak words that are easy on the ear and on the heart. When I'm tempted to get wrapped up in my own little world, remind me there's a great big world out there full of hurts and needs. Because love is not easily angered and keeps no record of wrongs, help me to forgive others as you have forgiven me. When I want to hold on to a grudge, gently help me release it so I can reach out a hand of love instead. Because love does not delight in evil but rejoices in truth, help me stand up for what is right and good. May I defend the defenseless and help the helpless. Show me how I can make a difference. Because love always protects and always trusts, help me to be a refuge for those around me. When the world outside is harsh and cold, may my heart be a place of acceptance and warmth. Finally, because love always perseveres, help my heart continually beat with love for you and others. Thank you for showing us again what the word love really means. Amen. What about some comments? What do you think about love in our church? Be nice.